What we on the Identity Council really have, the tools in our toolbox are the activities that we have. Yes, we look at mDL, but we also look at other things. We support the Access Council. We work with other industry councils as well. We have a number of activities with the federal government, but I want to talk to you specifically about the efforts on mDL and some of the pieces that you've seen today and where we're walking into the future. Some of the key things like today's webinar: how do we raise awareness? How do we provide education? How do we start initial coordination? How do we really focus on those relying parties themselves? How do we start looking at the needs of relying parties and others? Okay. And again, what are some of the key challenges to adoption so that we as a greater community can go forward? So next slide. We've organized ourselves and we've grown over time essentially to a group that includes really characteristics of two different pieces. One, the capability providers, those people that provide the end-to-end capability for the consumers, for the market space. Okay. And the other piece of this is the relying parties working hand in hand, whether they're merchants, the transportation community, the health community, others. How do others look at this? How do they consider adoption as relying parties? What are the investments? What's the challenges going forward? So in some cases, you're going to see on the capability providers, we're working very closely with AMVA and the state issuers. We have those that make the products, those that are actually the service providers. And then again, when we look over at some of the relying parties, whether that a relying party might be someone like TSA, or when we're looking at the healthcare community and others, how do we start really understanding the needs of people? So this is how we've organized. Again, for those that are relying parties listening, I want to talk directly about how you might participate in the future. Next slide, please. In the initial activities that we've done a strong white paper about both the mDL, the ecosystem, the strengths, the values. For those that haven't seen the white paper, I encourage you to look at it. It's available online. It's a very strong white paper. It says, here's where we are, where we're going. Here's where we're at. Here's some things that we need to address as a community, and hopefully you're picking up some of those today. Again, David laid out the path of the webinars that you're hearing today. And the next one that you'll hear is probably in December. And again, this is starting to go into the discussions of how, as a relying party, do you start thinking about consuming mDLs that have been issued by another state? Okay, so that should be a really great discussion. I'd ask you to keep an eye out for that, because again, part of this is we have a very dynamic environment. We have a very distributed environment. So how do we start planning that discussion between issuers, the people that provide the capabilities, and the relying parties? So that discussion will take place in December. Next slide, please. So when we talk about relying party focused activities, so we worked with the Alliance's chapter organization, the U.S. Payments Forum. Again, that represents all the major retailers. They look at merchants and retail communities, the rule sets that they have, what their preferences are, deep understanding of that community. So again, it gives us the ability to understand what key issues might be for the community, what the priorities are. As we talk over for transportation, if you've listened to some of the earlier webinars, TSA is an early relying party, and as they're thinking about things like use cases of bag drop, bag pickup, in addition to some of the screening. As we talk to the airports, how do the airports start thinking about this as well? So as we walk through different communities, okay, the healthcare community is working pilots on this, looking at everything from the pharma and the clinic side over to procurements as well. On the federal side, again, you will be from the Real ID Act and Real ID Act compliance. The federal government needs to check the document that you present, whether it's a standard card, driver's license, or an mDL, does it meet Real ID? Again, another customer in this discussion. State and local governments, they consume driver's licenses as a matter of course. Again, certainly the law enforcement community, okay? but also other communities. Again, the food and beverage community, you saw that in one of David's presentations before. Okay, next slide, please. So when we talk about the guidance that needs to take place, what is it you as a relying party that has an enterprise, what are the key issues? What is it really required to make a decision on your side about a change in enterprise operations? So again, part of this is relying parties need to know. In some case, for a group like NASIO, who really looks at all of the states in coordination with the states and really between the IT leaders in the state, how would they consume an mDL? This is a primary benefit, and it really helps the launch of the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So as we're looking forward, in the white paper, we've seen areas that we can prioritize on and work together looking in the future. One of the key things that I'm asking everyone that's part of the webinar and those that listen into the future is, how do you want to participate? There's room for everybody. This is very, very big. As we look at this, there's efforts that UL will be leading on the test and certification side. There's activities that AMVA really does want your participation and support. We have relying parties that really need to understand how, as a community of relying parties, whether that's the aviation sector or the law enforcement sector, what's the key dependencies? If we just talk about the law enforcement community themselves, they have 14 different use cases. And you would say, well, how does this integrate with e-ticketing? How does this integrate in with driver's license readers? If we're talking on the healthcare side, one of the things that you would say is, well, how does this integrate with the pharma operations, the clinic operations? Okay. On the health services side, some of the questions that people are looking at is an mDL in addition identities are available. How will that support better health services and health delivery? So there is a lot of activities that are starting in parallel. When we talk about jump-starting the ecosystem, no one will really see value if they only look at a single relying party. So some of the strategies that we're looking at is, how do we bring multiple relying parties together so that the user experience is richer, where it really makes sense for somebody to consider buying an mDL, because there'll be certain numbers of relying parties that are ready to work together. If the individual consumers get value, and if the relying parties get value, part of the coordination is can we discount? Can we incentivize? How might we do that? That was raised earlier in the discussion. So one of the first communities that you'll see some level of density, some level of commitment around various relying parties will probably be the aviation community. But for those that are on the line, one of the questions that I would ask is, how would you start driving this within your communities, because there's just so much value? Next slide, please. So the ask that we really want people to consider is, first, let's support the overall awareness and education of the ISO-based standard. Okay, the standard should be complete by the end of the year. It should be published early next year. We'll have a final standard. Okay, how do we think about an mDL? Well, just think about right off the bat, where do you consume a driver's license? And already knowing that an mDL can reduce cost, reduce risk. It provides a much better quality of service and life, user experience. That's going to drive us into this touch-free experience in itself. Okay, so again, on these things, please consider, if you have working groups now, think about the discussion in your working group. Think about how we might work and collaborate together. And lastly, if we collaborate, whether you're the rental car community, which we're collaborating with, or the National Notaries Association, or other groups, how might you want to have representatives part of our team that are taking place within the core group, so that they're getting a more holistic understanding of what's going on, how they can look at, if you would, people that have same problem, different problem set. So we encourage you, again, to participate looking into the future.